1740. A British fleet sails out under Commodore George Anson, nearly 2,000 men strong, bound for a voyage that will circle the globe. 4 years later, fewer than 200 of them make it home, and almost none of them die in battle. They die slowly, in their hammocks and at their posts, gums swelling and blackening, old scars from childhood wounds splitting back open as if the years never healed them at all, teeth loosening in place, men too weak to climb a rope or lift an oar. Officers write in their logs about a strange, creeping despair that settles over the crew before the physical symptoms even show themselves. Some men simply lie down and stop moving, not from any single collapse, but from a slow draining away of will, as though something inside them has quietly given up long before their bodies do. Surgeons aboard have no name for what they are watching. They try bleeding their patients. They try changing the men's diets in whatever small ways a ship at sea allows. Nothing works, because nobody yet understands that this disease has nothing to do with infection, or bad air, or any of the theories crowding medical thinking at the time. Nobody aboard understands what is killing them. Nobody knows it has a name, and nobody yet knows that the cure for it has been growing quietly in orchards on the other side of the world for thousands of years, long before the first European ship ever left port. To understand how that cure was hiding in plain sight for so long, we have to go back far further than any navy, any empire, any war. We have to go back to the forested foothills of ancient Southeast Asia, where the ancestors of nearly every citrus fruit you have ever eaten first took root. Almost every citrus fruit sitting in your kitchen right now, the orange, the lemon, the lime, the grapefruit, traces its lineage back to just a small handful of wild ancestor species that barely exist anymore in their original form. Citrus domestication begins roughly 4,000 years ago, somewhere across the region spanning northeast India, southern China, and the islands and peninsulas of Southeast Asia, in dense, humid forest country where wild citrus relatives still grow untended even today. Genetic research has traced almost the entire citrus family tree back to 3 true ancestral species: the citron, the pomelo, and the mandarin. Nearly everything else, the sweet orange, the lime, the grapefruit, the countless modern hybrids lining supermarket shelves, is some natural or human-guided cross of those 3 original fruits, layered and relayered across centuries of cultivation, trade, and accidental cross-pollination. Sit with that for a second. The orange is not really its own species in the way we usually think about species. It is a cross that happened so long ago in human history that nature effectively beat us to genetic engineering by several thousand years. Early cultivators across ancient Asia weren't just eating these fruits and moving on. They were unknowingly running one of the longest, most successful breeding experiments in agricultural history, without a single written record of what they were actually doing or why it worked. They were selecting for sweetness, for thinner skin, for fewer seeds, generation after generation, guided by nothing more than taste and instinct, centuries before anyone had a word like genetics to describe what was happening in their own orchards. And as these hybrid fruits slowly spread outward from their forested birthplace, carried along footpaths and river routes and early trade caravans, they didn't move as food first. But for most of ancient history, citrus wasn't really food in the way we think of it today. It was something closer to sacred. Long before anyone bit into a sweet orange, an entire religious tradition built one of its most important holidays around a fruit that almost nobody could actually digest. That fruit was the citron, and its slow migration west out of Asia along ancient overland trade routes carried it into Persia and eventually across the wider Mediterranean world. In Jewish tradition, the citron became known as the etrog, a fruit held and blessed as one of the 4 sacred species central to the celebration of Sukkot, valued far more for its symbolism, its fragrance, and its unusual knobby beauty than for its taste, which is famously bitter and barely edible on its own. Merchants along the ancient trade routes understood this well, and a particularly fragrant, unblemished etrog could command a price that had nothing to do with its nutritional value and everything to do with its perfection as an object of devotion. At almost the same time, Persian and later Islamic gardens were cultivating citron and other early citrus varieties as prized ornamental and medicinal plants, planted in carefully irrigated courtyards where their scent alone was considered worth the effort of keeping them alive. For centuries, that was citrus's primary role in the world it was entering, a symbol of luxury, sanctity, and status, something to be smelled, admired, and displayed rather than casually eaten. The citron cracked open the door. What came through that door next would go on to reshape European gardens, European wealth, and eventually European survival at sea. By the 1600s, owning a single orange tree in the wrong climate could genuinely threaten to bankrupt a noble European family, and across the continent, aristocrats did it anyway. Arab traders had already carried sweeter citrus varieties through the Mediterranean world centuries earlier, moving fruit alongside spices and silk on the same long overland and maritime networks, and Portuguese and Spanish voyages during the Age of Exploration spread them further still, eventually carrying citrus seeds across the Atlantic into the Americas on ships that had no idea they were also carrying, quite literally, the eventual cure for one of the deadliest diseases at sea. European nobility began constructing elaborate glass and brick structures known as orangeries, essentially the first true greenhouses, built at enormous expense purely to nurse fragile trees through the cold months, complete with dedicated staff whose entire job was keeping a handful of trees alive through winters they were never meant to survive. These weren't practical farming operations. They were status symbols, monuments to how much wealth and manpower a family could afford to pour into something as impractical as fruit that could just as easily have been imported already ripe. Visitors touring these estates would be shown the orangery the way they might be shown a gallery of paintings, as proof of taste and fortune rather than a working part of the household economy. Meanwhile, Spanish missionaries carrying citrus seeds into Florida and California during this same period were, almost by accident, planting the seeds of two future citrus empires, doing so not out of any grand economic vision, but simply because citrus was familiar, useful for cooking, and easy enough to grow in a warm climate that reminded them of home. But none of this made citrus essential yet. It would take a mysterious disease, killing sailors by the thousands, to turn citrus from a rich man's hobby into a matter of national survival. In 1747, a Scottish ship's surgeon named James Lind did something almost nobody in medicine had ever systematically done before. Aboard the HMS Salisbury, Lind selected 12 sailors already suffering from the disease, paired them off, and gave each pair a different remedy: cider, vinegar, seawater, a mild acid mixture, an herbal paste, and, for one pair only, 2 oranges and a lemon each day. He kept the men's conditions otherwise identical: same quarters, same base diet, same duties as their strength allowed, isolating the one variable he actually wanted to test in a way that almost nobody at sea had bothered to do before. Within days, the results were unmistakable. The pair given citrus recovered dramatically, one of them well enough to return to light duty within about a week, while every other pair showed little to no improvement at all. It was one of the first controlled clinical trials in the history of medicine, conducted in the cramped, rolling quarters of a warship, using nothing more sophisticated than careful observation and a willingness to actually compare outcomes side by side. You would think that settled the matter immediately. It didn't. Lind published his findings in a lengthy treatise a few years later, but the writing was dense, cluttered with competing theories he himself wasn't fully willing to abandon, and it landed inside a medical establishment that had its own entrenched ideas about what caused the disease, ideas involving bad air, poor digestion, and general moral laxity among sailors far more than any missing nutrient. The Royal Navy, tangled in competing theories and institutional inertia, sat on his conclusions for nearly 50 years before doing anything meaningful about them, while sailors kept dying of a disease that already had a known, published cure sitting in a book on a shelf somewhere in London. Through those same decades, citrus was slowly working its way into everyday life across Europe and its colonies, in smaller ways. Marmalade on breakfast tables, lemonade sold as a refreshing luxury in the streets of European cities, candied citrus peel handed out as a treat at winter gatherings, even as the fruit's life-saving properties remained officially unrecognized by the very institution that needed them most. It is a strange kind of historical irony that ordinary civilians were casually enjoying citrus as a pleasant indulgence at the exact same time that sailors just a short distance away, on ships anchored in the same harbors, were dying for lack of it. The answer sitting in market stalls within walking distance of the docks. Before you assume this story ends well, understand that Britain finally did solve scurvy in 1795, mandating citrus juice rations across the Royal Navy, a change so effective that British sailors earned the nickname limeys, a name that started as a slight from other nations and eventually became something closer to a badge of survival. Ships that had once lost a third or more of their crew to the disease on long voyages began completing entire circumnavigations, with barely a case reported. A transformation so dramatic that some officers at the time struggled to believe a single dietary change could account for it. And then, less than a century later, Britain quietly, unknowingly, broke the very solution that had saved so many lives. As the Navy switched from Mediterranean lemons to cheaper West Indian limes, partly for cost and partly for convenience of supply from British colonial territory, and as processing methods, including prolonged exposure to copper piping and extended storage, destroyed much of the fruit's actual potency, the cure began quietly failing without anyone understanding why. Vitamin C itself wouldn't be identified until the 1930s, so for decades, nobody could explain why scurvy crept back even after the official cure had become standard policy. And expeditions in the age of polar exploration, far removed from any naval mandate, would go on to suffer their own scurvy outbreaks precisely because nobody yet grasped what the citrus had actually been supplying all along. Britain's fix had come from trial and observation, not real understanding, and that same gap, the space between a solution that works and a solution that is actually understood, is still shaping a very different citrus crisis happening right now. Right now, today, a disease with no known cure is quietly wiping out entire citrus groves across multiple continents, and most people have never even heard its name. It's called Huanglongbing, or citrus greening disease, spread by a tiny insect known as the Asian citrus psyllid that carries a bacterium from tree to tree as it feeds, injecting it directly into the plant's vascular system with every bite. First identified in Asia decades ago, where it has plagued growers for over a century in some regions, it has since spread through Florida into California and Texas, across Brazil and beyond, carried partly by the insect's own movement and partly, tragically, by the global trade in citrus plants and cuttings that once helped spread the fruit's popularity in the first place. There is no widely available cure, only limited containment strategies, aggressive insecticide use, the removal and destruction of infected trees before they can spread the bacterium further, and desperate efforts to breed resistant rootstock before the disease outpaces every orchard trying to survive it. Infected trees produce fruit that turns bitter, lopsided, and partially green even when ripe, long before the tree itself dies outright. And once a tree is infected, there is currently no way to reverse the process, only to slow it. Florida's once massive orange production, an industry that for generations defined the state's identity as much as its beaches did, has fallen to a small fraction of its historic peak. An industry hollowed out by an insect most people will never see, sitting quietly on the underside of a leaf. The fruit that once saved a navy from an invisible enemy at sea is now fighting an invisible enemy of its own on land. And this time, nobody has a controlled trial with an obvious, immediate answer waiting at the end of it. Humanity solved scurvy through luck and observation almost as much as real science, and there's a real chance we're repeating that same mistake with citrus now. A real solution appears, then gets quietly undermined by incomplete understanding, whether that's a navy switching lemons for limes without knowing why the switch mattered, or modern agriculture leaning on containment measures without a true cure waiting behind them. The modern citrus greening crisis is following an eerily similar arc, a threat identified early, only partially understood, contained rather than cured, spreading a little further every season while researchers race to catch up, testing everything from genetically modified resistant trees to targeted antimicrobial injections to biological controls that might knock back the psyllid population itself. Zoom out today. Brazil and China stand as the two largest citrus producers on Earth, followed by the United States, Mexico, and Mediterranean growers like Spain and Egypt. Each of them now watching the spread of citrus greening with a level of concern that would have seemed unthinkable a generation ago. Citrus greening has now been confirmed across multiple continents, and researchers are racing to breed resistant varieties, splicing in genes from distantly related citrus relatives, and even, in some experimental programs, from entirely different plant families, trying to outpace a disease that has so far outpaced every attempt to contain it. Some groves have turned to intensive monitoring instead, sending workers through rows of trees week after week to spot the telltale mottled leaves early enough to remove a single infected tree before the bacterium can spread to its neighbors. A slow and expensive form of triage that treats symptoms one tree at a time rather than solving the underlying problem. Other researchers are experimenting with trapping and releasing sterile psyllids to collapse the insect population itself, borrowing a strategy first developed decades ago against entirely different agricultural pests. None of it, so far, adds up to anything close to a cure. Limes didn't actually work nearly as well against scurvy as lemons did, containing meaningfully less vitamin C to begin with, even before processing losses were factored in. And the Navy's cost-driven switch may have quietly cost lives for decades. The real story behind the nickname limey, a term that in hindsight commemorates a partial solution rather than a complete one. Almost no citrus sold today is a truly pure original species. Nearly everything is hybrid, built on hybrid. Generation after generation of crossbreeding, stacked so deep that untangling any modern variety's true ancestry required the kind of genetic sequencing that simply didn't exist until recent decades. And the grapefruit, often assumed ancient, is actually a chance hybrid accident first documented in Barbados in the 1700s, a natural cross between a pomelo and a sweet orange that nobody deliberately engineered, discovered rather than invented, and only later cultivated deliberately once growers realized what they had stumbled onto. Cut back to that fleet under Commodore Anson, still limping across the ocean, still losing men who have no idea the cure is already growing thousands of miles away. In orchards their own countrymen back home are cultivating purely for the pleasure of owning something rare and fragrant. A fruit that took nearly 4,000 years to be understood eventually saved a navy through a solution nobody fully grasped until decades after it had already started quietly failing again. Proof that a cure can exist in plain sight for generations before anyone connects it to the disease it solves. And right now, that same fruit is facing a threat with no cure in sight and no timeline for when one arrives, a mirror image of the very crisis it once helped end. Scurvy took the Navy nearly 50 years to solve after the proof was already sitting ignored on someone's desk. 50 years measured in thousands of preventable deaths across ships that could have carried the answer in their own hold the entire time. Citrus greening has already been spreading, largely unchecked, for more than 20 years and counting. And every season that passes without a true cure is another season of groves, quietly hollowed out, tree by tree, orchard by orchard. The question nobody can answer yet is whether the world solves this crisis before it's too late, and what a future without abundant citrus would actually look like, not just for breakfast tables and grocery aisles, but for an agricultural inheritance that took 4,000 years, 3 ancestral species, and 1 very lucky, very overdue naval discovery to build in the first place.